The human special ops team's arrival made the alien mercenaries shit their space diapers and run crying back to their mummies. Those blue-skinned, four-armed pussies took one look at the elite human operators and noped the fuck out faster than a pack-led prostitute bolts after getting her 5 credits. I'm Chris Ward, a 35-year-old former Special Forces operator. Now I work as a mercenary doing the dirty work for the galaxy's scum. This time, a crusty, 8-foot-tall, pack-led warlord named Prylar hired me to lead his team of 50 overgrown Smurf bodybuilders. The op? A surprise attack on the human colony of New Istanbul. The dangling carrot? A massive payday for putting the colony's 10,000 innocent men, women and children in chains. So there I was, aboard Prylar's warship Krojak, watching a hologram of the colony's pitiful defenses, 20 automated turrets and 100 weekend warriors guarding their underground hidey hole. My finger hovered over the button that would rain hell on my own kind. Then the alarm started screeching like a Garblaxian banshee in heat. "Sir, fast mover coming in hot," the sensor operator, a packlid named Grylock, yelled. The blood drained from Prylar's scarred face as he watched the human stealth ship dance around his missiles like a crackhead ballerina. I gritted my teeth, knowing that Special Ops team would royally fuck our shit up. If they took out Prylar, there'd be no one to pay me. Worse, the packlads would pin the blame on me and toss my ass out the airlock. Prylar's beady eyes locked with mine, both of us realizing this op was about to go sideways faster than a one-legged Zorblaxian in an ass-kicking contest. The packlid mercs started fidgeting, their 4 hands twitching towards the escape pods. I had to salvage this clusterfuck before it was too late. If I didn't, my only payment would be a laser bolt to the back of the head, courtesy of Prylar. The Krojak's alarms howled as the human stealth ship sliced through the void, sleek and deadly. Captain Sarah Briggs, a hardened veteran with ice in her veins, guided the ship with practiced ease. Her team of 5 Special Forces operatives, each hand-picked for their lethal skills, checked their weapons and armor, preparing for the assault. With a few keystrokes, the ship's hacker bypassed the packlid defenses, and the stealth ship latched onto the Krojak's airlock like a hungry lamprey. Chris scrambled through the corridors with a dozen packlid mercs, their blue skins slick with sweat as they raced to intercept the boarders. The airlock hissed open, and Sarah's team emerged, clad in midnight black-powered armor that made them look like demons from the deepest pits of hell. The packlads opened fire, their blasters scorching the walls, but the humans moved with inhuman speed and precision. Chris dove for cover as plasma bolts whizzed past his head. He popped up, squeezing off a few shots, but the humans' armor shrugged them off like raindrops. He couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for their skill and tech, even as he fought to put them down. Lieutenant Mike Donovan, Sarah's right-hand man, lobbed a volley of plasma grenades into the packled ranks. The explosions tore through the mercs, sending scorched limbs and shattered equipment flying. Chris grabbed Prylar, who was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and dragged him away from the carnage. They stumbled into the armory, locking the door behind them. Prylar slumped against a crate, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Chris pulled up the security feeds, watching as the human operatives cut through the remaining mercs like a plasma torch through butter. "We underestimated them," Chris muttered, his mind racing. Prylar snarled, his beady eyes burning with rage. "Take the rest of the men and wipe them out," he spat, blood flecking his lips. But as Chris watched the humans work, doubt began to gnaw at his gut. The packled's brutality, their disregard for innocent lives, it went against everything he'd once stood for as a soldier. He made a decision, one that could either save his soul or damn him to an airlock grave. Chris opened a secure comm channel to Krolak, a grizzled packled merc who'd seen too much blood and death in his long career. "Krolak, gather the men who've had enough of this shit. We're going to help the humans stop Prylar's attack on New Istanbul." Krolak's scarred face filled the screen, his 4 eyes widening in surprise, but he nodded, understanding in his gaze. Chris cut the comm and took a deep breath. He pulled up the schematics of the Krojak's weapon systems, his mind already formulating a plan. It was a risk, a gamble that could cost him everything. But for the first time in years, He felt like he was fighting for something worth believing in. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door, ready to face whatever the universe had in store. It was time to show the galaxy what humans were really made of. Chris tapped Krolak on the shoulder. "Rally the others, it's now or never." The scarred Paklid nodded, gathering Grylok, Trazak, and Vornak. Chris outlined the plan. He and Krolak would head to the bridge and confront Pryla directly, while the others sabotaged the weapons and engines. They split up, each group moving with purpose through the Krojak's corridors. Blaster fire erupted around Chris and Krolak as they pushed toward the bridge. Pryla's loyalists fought viciously, but the defectors cut them down with ruthless efficiency. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with Captain Sarah Briggs and her team. "Hold your fire!" Chris yelled, raising his hands. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her rifle trained on his chest. "Give me one good reason not to ventilate you right now, traitor," she growled. Together they stormed the bridge. Pryla's guards opened fire, but they were no match for the combined might of the humans and defectors. Plasma bolts scorched the air, consoles exploded, and bodies hit the floor. Chris spotted Pryla across the chaos. The warlord's face twisted with rage. He charged, dodging and weaving through the crossfire. Pryla met him head-on, a plasma blade crackling to life in his hand. They clashed in a whirlwind of strikes and parries, the bridge dissolving into a blur around them. Pryla was fast and strong, but Chris had years of training and a newfound resolve. He knocked the blade from Pryla's grasp and slammed him against a bulkhead, his forearm pressed against the warlord's throat. Pryla spat curses, his eyes bulging. Chris hesitated, torn between the desire for revenge and the need for justice. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently. Grylok's voice crackled over the comms. "Engines are fucked! This bucket's going down!" Chris hauled Pryla to his feet, dragging him towards the human stealth ship. Sarah and the others fell in behind them, fighting a rearguard action as the Krojak began to break apart around them. They stumbled into the airlock, just as a massive explosion tore through the warship. The stealth ship detached, engines flaring as it pulled away. Chris watched through a viewport as the Krojak disintegrated, its hull plates peeling away like the skin of a rotten fruit. He sagged against the wall, exhaustion and relief washing over him. They'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. Pryla still had forces on New Istanbul, and the warlord himself needed to face justice. But for now, Chris allowed himself a small smile. He'd taken the first step towards redemption, and that was enough for today. The human stealth ship's engines whined as it knifed through New Istanbul's atmosphere. Chris Ward stared out the viewport, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, Captain Sarah Briggs listened intently to the comm chatter, her face a mask of concentration. Suddenly a holographic display flickered to life, revealing the haggard face of Governor Marcus Holloway. "Captain Briggs, we have a situation," he said, his voice strained. "A group of Paklid mercenaries have landed on the outskirts of the colony. They're headed straight for the main settlement, and they're heavily armed." "A warrior named Kravok," Holloway replied. "Intel suggests he's Pryla's second-in-command." Chris slammed his fist against the bulkhead, the metal ringing with the impact. Pryla's not taking any chances. Kravok's his backup plan. Sarah nodded grimly. "We need to move fast, gear up and get ready to deploy." The stealth ship touched down just outside the settlement, kicking up clouds of dust. Chris, Sarah and their teams disembarked, weapons at the ready. Krolak and the other Paklid defectors fell in beside them, their faces set with determination. They moved quickly, setting up a defensive perimeter around the colony. Barricades were hastily erected, and snipers took up positions on rooftops and in windows. The air crackled with tension as they waited for the enemy to arrive. The sound of heavy footsteps and guttural war cries shattered the silence. Kravok and his mercenaries charged into the settlement, plasma weapons spitting fire. They were clad in heavy armor, their faces twisted with rage and bloodlust. Chris and Sarah opened fire, their weapons barking as they cut down the first wave of attackers. The Paklid defectors joined the fray, their knowledge of Paklid tactics proving invaluable. Krolak barked orders, directing his men to target weak points in the enemy's armor. The battle raged through the streets, plasma bolts scorching the air. Buildings crumbled under the onslaught, debris raining down on the combatants. Chris fought his way through the chaos, his rifle blazing as he took down one mercenary after another. Suddenly a massive figure loomed before him. Kravok, his armor splattered with blood, hefted a plasma axe, its blade crackling with energy. He let out a roar and charged, his eyes burning with hatred. Chris met him head-on, his rifle forgotten as he drew his combat knife. They clashed in a flurry of blows, Kravok's axe whistling through the air. Chris ducked and weaved, his knife flashing as he sought an opening. The fight carried them up a flight of stairs and onto a rooftop. Kravok pressed his advantage, his axe a blur of motion. Chris felt the blade slice through his armor, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth and lunged forward, his knife aimed at Kravok's throat. But the pack-lead was too fast. He batted the knife aside and kicked Chris in the chest, sending him sprawling. Kravok raised his axe, a triumphant grin on his face. A crack split the air and Kravok staggered, a neat hole appearing in his chest. He toppled forward, his axe clattering to the ground. Chris looked up to see Sarah, her sniper rifle still smoking. The battle was over. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran, disappearing into the streets. Chris slumped against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah and the others gathered around him, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. "We did it," Krolak said, his voice tinged with awe. "We beat them." But Chris shook his head. "This is just the beginning," he said, his gaze hardening. "Pryler's still out there, and he won't stop until he's destroyed everything we hold dear." Sarah nodded, her hand resting on Chris's shoulder. "Then we'll just have to stop him first." The dust settled over the colony of New Istanbul, the bodies of fallen Paklid mercenaries littering the streets. Chris Ward and Captain Sarah Briggs stood amid the wreckage, their armor scorched and dented from the fierce battle. Governor Marcus Holloway approached them, his face lined with exhaustion and relief. "You've saved the colony," Holloway said, clasping their hands. "We owe you our lives." Chris nodded, his gaze drifting to the Paklid defectors who had fought alongside them. "We couldn't have done it without their help." Sarah turned to Krolak, the scarred Paklid who had proven his loyalty. "We're going to need your help to fortify the colony's defenses and establish a more permanent alliance with your people." Krolak straightened, his four eyes gleaming with pride. "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure our survival." Over the next few days, Chris and Sarah worked tirelessly with Governor Holloway and the colonists to shore up New Istanbul's defenses. They reinforced the perimeter, set up early warning systems, and trained the colonists in basic combat techniques. Krolak served as a liaison between the humans and the Pakled defectors, helping to bridge the gap between their cultures. But just as they began to feel a sense of security, a new threat emerged. The colony's long-range sensors detected a massive Paklid warship entering the star system, its hull bristling with weapons. Chris and Sarah gathered in the command center, their faces grim as they studied the holographic display. "The Zortax," Krolak growled, his fists clenching. "Commanded by General Grozak, one of Pryler's most loyal and cunning strategists." Sarah nodded, her jaw set. "We have to stop it before it can land its troops." An idea sparked in Chris's mind, dangerous and daring. "We still have the captured Paklid stealth ship. If we can infiltrate the Zortax and disable it from within—" Sarah's eyes widened, catching on to his plan. "It's risky, but it might be our only chance." They quickly assembled a small team of their most skilled operatives and Paklid defectors, including Krolak. As they boarded the stealth ship, Chris felt a sense of déjà vu, remembering his earlier mission aboard the Krojak. But this time, he was fighting for the right side. The stealth ship slipped undetected through the Zortax's defenses, its advanced cloaking technology masking their approach. They docked with the warship's airlock, the magnetic clamps locking into place with a dull thunk. Inside the Zortax, they split into two teams. Chris and Krolak led a group towards the bridge to confront General Grozak, while Sarah and the others headed for the engine room to sabotage the ship's power core. As Chris and Krolak fought their way through the corridors, the resistance grew increasingly fierce. Grozak's elite guards, clad in heavy armor and wielding plasma rifles, threw themselves at the intruders with fanatical zeal. The air filled with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh as plasma bolts scorched the walls. They finally reached the bridge, the doors sliding open to reveal General Grozak waiting for them, surrounded by his most loyal soldiers. The pack-led general was an imposing figure, his armor adorned with the scars of 100 battles. "Did you really think you could catch me by surprise?" Grozak sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. Chris and Krolak exchanged a tense look, realizing they had walked into a trap. Grozak had anticipated their plan and had laid in wait, ready to crush their desperate gambit. Meanwhile, in the bowels of the ship, Sarah and her team fought their way into the engine room. The chamber thrummed with power, the reactor core pulsing with an eerie blue light. But as they approached, they found their path blocked by a heavily armed contingent of pack-led engineers and guards. Plasma fire filled the air as the two sides clashed, the human operatives and pack-led defectors fighting desperately to reach the power core. Sarah ducked behind a console, popping up to squeeze off a few shots before dropping back down. Inch by hard-fought inch, they pushed forward, the pack-led defectors using their knowledge of the ship's layout to find alternate routes and flank their enemies. Finally, they reached the core, planting the explosive charges with trembling hands. But just as they armed the last charge, alarms began to blare throughout the ship. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that Grozak was aware of their presence. The Zortax shuddered as its weapon systems came online, preparing to obliterate the intruders. Sarah looked to her team, seized the fear and determination in their eyes. They had come too far to fail now. She gritted her teeth, knowing that they had to act fast to ensure the success of their mission, no matter the cost. The fate of New Istanbul, and the fragile alliance between humans and pack-led defectors, hung in the balance as the two teams faced their greatest challenge, yet aboard the Zortax. Chris and Krolak stared down General Grozak on the bridge, while Sarah and her team raced against time in the engine room, desperate to complete their sabotage before they were discovered. On the bridge of the Zortax, plasma bolts crackled through the air as Chris and Krolak dove for cover behind sparking consoles. General Grozak stood tall amidst the chaos, his cannon spewing devastating energy blasts. Chris popped up to squeeze off a few shots, then ducked back down as a searing bolt nearly took his head off. "We can't stay pinned down like this," Krolak yelled over the din of battle. Chris nodded, his mind racing. He scanned Grozak's armor, searching for any weakness. There, a small gap near the neck, barely visible as the general moved. Chris signaled to Krolak, who gave a curt nod. The scarred pack-lid rose, laying down a blistering barrage of cover fire. Chris took a deep breath, lining up his shot. Time seemed to slow as he squeezed the trigger, the pulse rifle kicking against his shoulder. The burst caught Grozak in the throat, searing through the gap in his armor. The general stumbled, his cannon clattering to the deck as he crumpled. The remaining guards, seeing their leader fall, quickly threw down their weapons in surrender. In the engine room, Sarah and her team worked feverishly to set the charges. Sweat poured down Sarah's face as she armed the last explosive, the device beeping ominously. Suddenly the doors burst open, and a squad of pack-led soldiers stormed in, plasma rifles blazing. Sarah's team scrambled for cover, returning fire as best they could. But the pack-lids were too many, their weapons too powerful. Sarah gritted her teeth, realizing they were out of time. "Fall back to the extraction point," she ordered, her voice barely audible over the roar of plasma fire. Her team hesitated, unwilling to leave her behind. "Go, now! That's an order!" As her team reluctantly retreated, Sarah hunkered down behind a massive power conduit, her rifle clutched tight. The pack-lid soldiers advanced, their boots ringing on the metal deck. Sarah closed her eyes, preparing for the end. Suddenly the sound of renewed gunfire echoed through the engine room. Sarah's eyes snapped open to see Chris and Krolak charging in, a group of human operatives and pack-lid defectors at their backs. The reinforcements caught the pack-lid soldiers off guard, scything them down with ruthless efficiency. Chris reached Sarah's side, helping her to her feet. "We have to go now!" he yelled, the ship shuddering around them. They raced through the crumbling corridors of the Zortax, dodging falling debris and gouts of flame. The power core was overloading, the ship tearing itself apart. They reached the stealth ship, just as a massive explosion ripped through the Zortax. The small craft rocketed away, the shockwave buffeting it as the warship disintegrated in a blinding flash of light. In the cockpit, Chris and Sarah slumped against each other. Exhaustion and relief etched on their faces. They had struck a devastating blow against Pryla, but the battle for New Istanbul was far from over. As the stealth ship hurtled towards the planet, they knew they had to be ready for what came next. The fate of the colony and everyone on it depended on them. The Zortax's destruction lit up the void, the brilliance visible even from New Istanbul's surface. In the colony's command center, Governor Holloway watched the distant conflagration, a mixture of hope and trepidation on his face. He turned as Chris, Sarah, and Krolak strode in, their armor scorched and dented. "So you did it," Holloway breathed, awe in his voice. "You took out the Zortax?" Chris nodded, his expression grim. "Grozak and his men won't be a problem anymore, but Pryla's still out there, and he won't take this lying down." Sarah slammed her fist against the command center's map table, frustration etched on her face. "Pryla won't give up that easily. We need to be ready for his next move." Governor Holloway cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There may be a way. The colony has been working on a secret project, a prototype orbital defense cannon capable of taking out Pakled warships from the surface." Holloway sighed heavily. "It's unfinished. The cannon requires a rare power source to function, a highly unstable element called necrium. It can only be found in the treacherous southern canyons." Without hesitation, Chris stepped forward. "I'll lead a mission to retrieve the necrium. It's our best chance to defend the colony." Krolak, Trazak, and a handful of seasoned human scouts volunteered to join him. They quickly prepared, loading up a heavily armored convoy with weapons and supplies. As the sun began to set, they set out, the convoy's engines roaring to life. The journey through the southern canyons was treacherous, the narrow winding paths barely wide enough for their vehicles. Jagged rocks loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows in the fading light. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the canyon, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. "Ravagers!" Trazak yelled, his four eyes wide with fear. The massive, six-legged predators emerged from the shadows, their razor-sharp claws glinting in the twilight. Chris and his team leapt from the convoy, taking up defensive positions as the beasts charged. Plasma bolts lit up the canyon as the team fought desperately to fend off the Ravagers. Chris and Krolak worked in tandem, drawing the attention of the largest beast. It lunged at Chris, its jaws snapping mere inches from his face. Krolak flanked the creature, firing a barrage of plasma bolts into its side. The Ravager howled in pain, turning to face its new attacker. Chris seized the opportunity, leaping onto the beast's back and plunging his combat knife into its thick hide. The Ravager thrashed and bucked, trying to throw him off, but Chris held on, driving the knife deeper. With a final gurgling roar, the beast collapsed, its lifeblood pooling on the rocky ground. The team caught their breath, surveying the carnage. The remaining Ravagers had fled, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen brethren. They quickly regrouped and continued their journey, the necrium mine growing closer with each passing minute. As they approached the mine's entrance, an uneasy feeling settled over Chris. The facility appeared abandoned, its structures falling into disrepair. They cautiously entered, their weapons at the ready, the mine's dark tunnels swallowing them whole. Deep within the mine's bowels, they discovered a hidden cache of refined necrium, its eerie glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. But as they prepared to retrieve the precious cargo, a silent alarm tripped, its shrill cry echoing through the tunnels. "We've got company," Krolak growled, his eyes narrowing. A heavily armed Pakled strike team, led by the notorious mercenary Zorgak, flooded into the mine, their weapons spitting plasma. Chris and his team found themselves trapped, facing overwhelming odds. They managed to barricade themselves in a defensive position, the refined Necrium glowing softly behind them. But as the pack-led forces closed in, Chris knew they couldn't hold out forever. His mind raced, searching for a solution. Suddenly a plan formed, desperate and daring. He turned to Krolak, his voice low and urgent. "I'll create a diversion, draw their fire. You and the others escape with the Necrium. Get it back to the colony." "You sure about this?" Krolak asked, his voice a low rumble. "There's no going back." Chris met the pack-led's gaze, a fire burning in his eyes. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone. We started this together. We'll finish it together." Zorgak's men rounded the corner, their plasma rifles at the ready. Chris and Krolak opened fire, the tunnel erupting in a hail of blaster bolts. The pack-led soldiers fell, their armor no match for the humans' precision. But more kept coming, a relentless tide of flesh and steel. Chris and Krolak fell back, leapfrogging from cover to cover. They left a trail of bodies in their wake, the air thick with the stench of burnt meat. A plasma bolt seared past Chris's head, close enough to singe his hair. He returned fire, dropping the pack-led shooter with a clean headshot. Beside him, Krolak grappled with a hulking soldier, the two locked in a deadly embrace. Chris moved to help, but a sudden movement caught his eye. Zorgak himself, flanked by his elite guard. The mercenary's eyes glinted with malice, a plasma blade crackling in his hand. "Now!" Chris yelled, his finger tightening on the detonator. The charges exploded, the tunnel shaking with the force of the blast. Dust and debris filled the air, the sound of falling rock drowning out the cries of the wounded. Chris and Krolak pressed their advantage, picking off the disoriented survivors with ruthless efficiency. They moved deeper into the mine, the tunnels growing narrower with each step. But Zorgak's men kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Chris's rifle clicked empty, the last of his ammo spent. He drew his knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Beside him, Krolak fought like a man possessed, his massive fists crushing bone and pulping flesh. But even the pack-led's strength had its limits. A plasma bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another struck his leg, sending him to his knees. Chris stood over his fallen comrade, his knife held in a white-knuckle grip. The pack-led soldiers closed in, their weapons leveled at his chest. "It's been an honor," Krolak gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. But before he could move, the tunnel shook again, dust raining down from the ceiling. For a moment Chris thought it was another cave-in. But then he heard the sound of gunfire, the distinctive crack of human weapons. A figure emerged from the dust, a lithe form clad in black armor. Chris's heart leapt as he recognized the familiar profile. "Sarah," he breathed, hope surging through his veins. Sarah and her team poured into the tunnel, their weapons spitting fire. The pack-led soldiers fell back, caught off guard by the sudden reinforcements. "Looked like you could use a hand," Sarah said, her voice tinged with amusement. Together they pushed forward, driving the pack-led forces deeper into the mine. Zorgak's men fought with the desperate fury of cornered animals, but they were no match for the combined might of the humans and their pack-led allies. They chased Zorgak and his remaining soldiers into a hidden chamber, a vast cavern filled with strange pulsing machines. In the center of the room stood a towering device, its surface covered in glowing runes. "A teleporter," Chris breathed, realization dawning. Zorgak was never planning to escape. He was stalling for time. They raced forward, desperate to stop the mercenary before he could activate the device. But they were too late. Zorgak slammed his hand down on a glowing panel, a triumphant sneer on his face. A blinding flash filled the chamber, the air crackling with energy. When the light faded, Zorgak was gone, along with a cache of the alien technology. Chris, Sarah, and Krolak stood in the empty chamber, the weight of their failure pressing down on them. They had won the battle, but the war had just taken a dangerous turn. "We have to get back to the colony," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "With this technology, Pryla could be unstoppable." Chris nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. They had the Necrium, but at what cost? The fight for New Istanbul was far from over, and the stakes had just gotten higher. Chris, Sarah and Krolak emerged from the stealth ship, the Necrium clutched tight in their hands. But as they raced towards the colony, their hearts sank. New Istanbul was in flames, its streets choked with rubble and the bodies of the dead. Paklid soldiers swarmed through the settlement, their advanced weapons cutting down anyone in their path. "We're too late," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with horror. But Chris shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "Not yet. We have to get this Necrium to the orbital cannon. It's our only chance." They charged through the chaos, plasma bolts whizzing past their heads. Colonists ran in terror, some cut down by the merciless Paklid fire. Governor Holloway's voice crackled over the comms, barely audible over the screams and explosions. Chris and his team fought their way through the streets, Krolak's massive frame shielding them from the worst of the fire. They reached the cannon's control room, a small bunker hidden beneath the colony's central plaza. Inside they found a scene of carnage. The cannon's crew lay dead, their bodies riddled with plasma burns. Chris swallowed hard, pushing down the bile rising in his throat. He turned to Sarah and Krolak, his eyes hard. "Sarah, get that Necrium installed. Krolak, watch her back. I'll get the cannon online." They worked frantically, their hands slick with sweat and blood. Sarah slotted the Necrium into the cannon's power core, the device humming to life with an eerie green glow. Krolak stood guard at the door, his rifle barking as Paklid soldiers tried to force their way inside. "It's charging its main cannon," Sarah yelled, her eyes wide with fear. Chris gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the controls. He swung the cannon around, its barrel pointing skyward. The dreadnought filled the targeting display, its hull shimmering with a sickly green energy. "Firing solution locked," Chris said, his voice steady. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. He slammed his hand down on the firing stud. The cannon bucked, a blinding beam of energy lancing up into the sky. It struck the dreadnought dead center, the ship's shields flaring and dying in an instant. The beam tore through the hull, vaporizing metal and flesh alike. For a moment, the dreadnought hung in the sky, a gaping hole blown clean through its center. Then, with a silent scream of tortured metal, it exploded, its reactors detonating in a blinding flash of light. Debris rained down on the colony, smashing through buildings and cratering the streets. Chris sagged back in his chair, his heart pounding. On the displays, the Paklid forces were in full retreat, their resolve shattered by the destruction of their flagship. But the cost had been high. The colony lay in ruins, its people scattered and bleeding. Sarah's hand landed on his shoulder, her touch gentle. "We have to go, Chris. The evacuation ships are waiting." He nodded, hauling himself to his feet. They emerged from the bunker to a scene of devastation. The once thriving colony was now a smoking ruin, its streets littered with the dead and dying. Colonists stumbled towards the spaceport, their faces blank with shock and grief. Chris and his team joined the exodus, their weapons at the ready. They helped the wounded onto the waiting ships, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they couldn't save everyone. As the last ship lifted off, the sky above New Istanbul lit up with the flashes of orbital combat. In the cockpit of the lead ship, Chris slumped into a seat, his body aching with exhaustion. Sarah and Krolak joined him, their faces grim. A message blinked on the console, a distress call from a nearby colony. Chris's heart sank as he read the words, realizing the true scope of Pryler's plan. "This isn't over," he said, his voice hard. "Pryler's attacking across the entire sector. He's trying to wipe us out once and for all." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Then we'll stop him. We'll gather every ally we have, every ship and soldier we can muster, and we'll take the fight to him." Krolak nodded, his massive fists clenching. "The Paklid clans will fight at your side. Pryler has betrayed us all." As the fleet of evacuation ships jumped to hyperspace, Chris stared out at the stars, his mind racing with plans and strategies. He knew that the battles to come would be the hardest of his life, that the fate of countless lives hung in the balance. But he also knew that he had something Pryler could never understand, the unbreakable bonds of friendship and loyalty, the knowledge that he was fighting for something worth believing in. He turned to Sarah and Krolak, a grim smile on his face. "Let's go hunting." As the evacuation ship sped away from the smouldering ruins of New Istanbul, Chris and his team huddled in the cramped confines of the SS Sarah's briefing room. The weight of their losses hung heavy in the air, but they knew there was no time to grieve. Pryler's forces were still out there, and the war was far from over. "We can't keep running," Chris said, his voice hard with determination. "We have to take the fight to Pryler, hit him where it hurts." "Agreed," Krolak rumbled, his massive frame hunched over the holographic display of Pryler's stronghold, the Citadel. "But it won't be easy. The Citadel is a fortress, bristling with weapons and defenses." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes glinting with a fierce light. "Then we'll need an army. We have to rally every ally we can, human and Pakelet alike. It's time to end this, once and for all." Over the next few days, Chris and his team worked tirelessly, reaching out to every colony, every faction that had suffered under Pryler's brutal rule. They called in old debts, forged new alliances, and slowly but surely, a coalition began to form. Krolak reached out to his fellow Pakelet defectors, those who had grown disillusioned with Pryler's cruelty and lies. They came by the dozens, then the hundreds, ready to fight and die for a chance at a better future. As the fleet grew, Chris and Sarah pored over the schematics of the Citadel, searching for any weakness they could exploit. They knew that a frontal assault would be suicide, but if they could slip a small team inside, they might have a chance. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to a small maintenance hatch on the station's underbelly. "If we can get a strike team through here, we can disable the defenses from within." Chris nodded, his mind racing. "Krolak and his forces can launch a diversionary attack, draw their fire while we slip inside. It's risky, but it's our best shot." As the fleet approached the Citadel, the tension on the bridge was palpable. Chris and Sarah stood side by side, watching as the massive space station grew larger on the view screen. The Pakelet ship surged forward, their weapons blazing as they raked the Citadel's shields with fire. The station's defenses responded in kind, and soon the void was filled with the flashes of explosions and the screams of dying ships. Under cover of the chaos, Chris and Sarah's strike team slipped through the maintenance hatch, their weapons at the ready. They moved quickly, silently, disabling security systems and sabotaging key junctions. But as they pushed deeper into the station, they found themselves facing increasing resistance. Pryler's elite guards, fanatically loyal to their master, fought with a savage ferocity that bordered on madness. Chris and Sarah fought side by side, their weapons flashing as they cut down one enemy after another. But for every guard they killed, 2 more seemed to take their place, and soon they found themselves being pushed back, their ammunition running low. Chris and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come too far to turn back now. With a final desperate charge, they broke through the last line of defenses and burst into the command center. Pryler stood at the center of the room, his face twisted with rage and hatred. He was surrounded by his most loyal guards, each one ready to die for their master. "So the great Chris Ward comes to face me at last," Pryler sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can defeat me? I am a god among the Pakelet, and you are nothing but a traitor and a fool." Chris raised his weapon, his eyes hard as steel. "It's over, Pryler. Your army is broken, your stronghold is falling. Surrender now, and I'll spare your life." But Pryler only laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the chamber. "Spare my life. I would rather die than bow to a human. Guards, kill them all." The room erupted into chaos, plasma bolts and grenades filling the air. Chris and Sarah fought back to back, their weapons flashing as they cut down Pryler's guards one by one. But Pryler himself was a force to be reckoned with, his armor shrugging off their shots like raindrops. He charged at Chris, a plasma blade crackling in his hand, and the 2 warriors met in a clash of steel and fury. They traded blows, sparks flying as their weapons clashed. Pryler was strong, fast, and skilled, but Chris had the advantage of training and experience. He parried Pryler's blade, then lunged forward, his own weapon aimed at the warlord's throat. But Pryla was ready for him. With a lightning-fast move, he dodged Chris's strike and countered with a blow of his own, his blade slicing through Chris's armor and drawing blood. Chris staggered back, his vision swimming. Pryla pressed his advantage, raining down blows with a savage fury. Chris parried desperately, his strength fading with each passing second. Suddenly Sarah was there, her own blade flashing as she intercepted Pryla's strike. The two fought, their weapons a blur of motion, but Sarah was outmatched. With a final, brutal blow, Pryla sent her flying, her body slamming against the far wall with a sickening crunch. Chris roared with rage and grief, his pain and anger giving him newfound strength. He lunged at Pryla, his blade a blur of silver. The warlord staggered back, his defenses crumbling under the onslaught. With a final desperate strike, Chris's blade found its mark, piercing Pryla's heart. The warlord stared at him in shock and disbelief, then crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood pooling on the cold metal floor. Chris staggered to Sarah's side, cradling her broken body in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes flickering with pain. "You did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms and explosions. "You ended it." Chris shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, we did it, together. Just hold on, Sarah, we'll get you out of here, get you help." With a final shuddering breath, Sarah died in Chris's arms, her last words a whispered plea for peace and hope. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.